Patterns in nature in 12 steps. Quad 1 can be all the quads. It would end in bliss once the sun's limited theta will reach his 90 degrees. And you of course could reshape it as a cone to represent an inside and outside of God. Or we can mirror 4 quads. Quad 1 is active X, active Y, representing physical heaven, all solid elements on the periodic table. Quad 3 is passive X, passive Y, representing physical Earth with all solid elements. Thus, you can figure out the rest. Quad 2, then, is the non-physical part of heaven, and Quad 4 is the believer's non-physical life on Earth. 360 degrees or 0, then crossing over. 0 at the top is transcendence, not chaos, and after that secret it goes inward to balance and rest. Only after that rest it continues to 1. So also 6, which is man's day, goes next to the middle rest. So there are 2 in the middle like gluons. 1 lacks a red charge, for Jesus bled away God's push out of orbit because we're a need for God. Push is red. The other is perfect balance of all colors. We'll go through the color scale, the sons of Jacob, the first 12 elements, Hebrew alphabet, how sin was brought up to a tangent, how the electron sends away a photon when descending an energy level. We'll see the DNA patterns, Lord willing, and laws of Newton, thermodynamics, Kepler, distribution and giving love in Quad 1, transitiveness in Quad 2, communication and isolation in Quad 3, association in Quad 4, and more. So, be prepared to find out how small the world is when you compare it to God. Double meaning intended. One quad flips horizon, the other vertical, and the other both. Note, I'm using a dodecagon for number reference, but I see it as a sphere. The push and pull is the red and blue. Blue is the equal force in opposite direction, third law of Newton, third of a trinity. That is in particular the trinity right beside logic law's trinity. In my dream, the sphere was a plain green dopamine shell. Let's not crash dopamine or work too much. And remember, these are only natural patterns to help mental connections. Going down is adding layers, up is removing layers. 0, trust, undefined. This doesn't mean chaos and has no need of organization. Rather, it's transcendence which we trust no less than the best about. Although we can judge nothing against God, we can justify him in hopes of our own justification. God is always better than we can think or any pattern we can use. Purple is neutral, and a buffer for babies helps red acid H+. On our side it's green, clarity resolution scaled projector, like trees on earth, unless barren yellow without spirit. The arteries are red, pushing away from the heart, but veins move to the heart, having supplied us with Christ's Spirit. 1. Unity, undividable, so unconquerable, and therefore also omnipotence. None can knock the stool out from under God. So the Hebrew alphabet shows us God is as humble as he can be. It's necessary for God for our sakes, and because he's honest, with a strong ox like a cherub head. God is most excellent, unlike Jacob's first son. You form, for example, from one God to the law at 5, then over to us being most spiritual 10. This means that Christ fulfills the law in us, able to do and work anything ex nihilo, out of nothing. Notice the triangle, that forgiveness is ex nihilo, as Jesus matches the law, becoming prime creditor. The third in this trinity is how the Spirit brings forth fruit in us ex nihilo. Hydrogen is the first element, rises the fastest. It combines with oxygen to drink. Honest Nathaniel was the first disciple to recognize the true Son of God, unchanged until a force acts upon it. Light, polarity, shape, parable, pearl. 2. Direction, a ray to give, unlike Simeon, who with Levi did not move in that direction of grace and thus would be divided like tools, because that's how they treated people. You must have grace or you won't stand. That is the way of life at a deep level. I mean, the universe is not about evening out, but going forward. By grace, power is shared with God, As a wire, there's 2 pushes of current out like norepinephrine and 2 pushes of electrons in like serotonin. Electrons represent spirit. Red jasper is the biblical stone and means is C on the piano, while blue sapphire is OH-, a base. Longer wavelengths are red to push away sin with inertia. Shorter ones cause the backflow. TTT quadrant for DNA make phenylalanine for melanin and adrenaline. Notice the direction around this entire thing is constant. Going around counterclockwise means the current or hate is coming down to you, and electrons of love are pulling you back upward to God. Each one input the next, especially at 2. 2 is the conception, the reason, the count. Like we should count the cost before building bigger barns. Helium is the most stable element, there's order. Goodness divides a blessing. Remember that function only have one output, just as God had only one begotten Son. Object in motion remains in motion. Loud sounds organized. 3. Trinity. Notice all 3 of the first sons were negative. So also, these 3 points are the negative x coordinate. Also, remember that in the New Testament, Levi's name was changed to Matthew, which means gift. He had been among those considered ungracious, balance, bending. There's a push in either direction in this third line, necessarily forming polarity. Christ leaves home for us. The spiritual output of the word, the function. The input was from 1. The third in this triangle is 12. God assents to the counsel of his own will, which informs him being omniscient. This is all represented at 12, another year parable. Lithium is a solid, so this is Christ's Spirit stepping into the physical realm bodily. Although the specific aspect of his body will come with the ordinances. It is the lightest weight metal and has the highest specific heat capacity. Lithium is great at working with ions like sin, waters-gathered plants. Newton and thermodynamics, Jesus stayed in motion and lower to a lesser energy level. Time's arrow, no going back. Photon released when electron drops energy level. 4. Quadrants, sun and moon were made. If you try to balance and exchange everything, it's because they're not priceless. Of course, Jesus would exchange the temporary for eternal. That's a good deal, but never sell the truth. Speaking of the law of ID, the ID of God to us is Jesus, who's the identity of his group of saints, referring to point 4 times 2. Jesus is point 4, so also Judah the 4th son. The lion head of cherubs is also represented here. Although Jesus' spirit was point 3, his mind is point 4, and body is point 5. Believers' spiritual life is in the 3rd quadrant, but comes from the perspective of body for 8, mind for 9, and spirit for 10. At the same time, they can be seen as chronological progression, so also here with Jesus. Beryllium is toxic against unbelievers, and sound preaching travels faster through it than any other metal. Preach the mind of Jesus. Electromagnetic waves aren't audible, but they can cause physical things to vibrate, which would then become sound. So the Spirit has us preach the gospel. From 4 to 8 is the spread of what we see of God, from Christ's mind to what the Spirit shows us, that is. Will is only the edge of your heart, which is only the edge of your patterns of understanding. They touch each other like gears. Emerald for John. Second law of Newton, a force accelerates a mass, Jesus. Parable, Lazarus, unforgiving servant. 5. Birds and fish made. The first self-reflecting shape is a pentagon. It draws itself. Proportionality might compares to antipode, Pentateuch. God's law is like looking into a mirror, says James. I suppose this then would have to do with consciousness and conscience too. The Hebrew alphabet tells us that it's revelation. 5 is patterns, and God gives his. Boron is slow to ignite, but only has a green flame. Without a red-blue bias yet, it is, importantly to us, part of God's buffer curse thorns. Its purpose is not to destroy or even exact, although it can be used for that. Its purpose is to bring us to Christ, It's given outside of God and in a margin area which is from the horizontal to the outer sphere. So it's not purple. I know this because of the sin from the adjacent father, whose will is 90-degree righteous. The sin has both an outside and inside. The outside is those outside of the Spirit. And Jesus is the hypotenuse ray that brings sin up to tangent for those with the Spirit. But at the end point, the unbeliever has only push from God and no more error margin. The piano makes a gavel-like sound here that causes you to straighten up as you're fudging. 5 is a shared order, reflecting even emotions. Boron, like the law, atomically compare 6 and 8. That is the sins against flesh. It shows need for change, that is exchange of Christ. Gold is yellow like sin, which lack fertility, especially due to long red wavelengths of wrath. The law shows a gap in our relationship to God, which is sin. Boron can burn because the law is spiritual. Issachar had 2 burdens. I guess it means 2 tables of stone. Issachar, strong ass, saw a pleasant land and assented to serve. Zebulon, sapphire costal boundary. Parable. New garment into old bottle. Good Samaritan. 6th Dan was Jacob's 6th son summed, serpent bites heel, law enhanced, independence lost, long expected salvation. Man was made on this day. Jesus is the direction of love. Sin stayed nailed to the cross, unlike Jesus, who carried it away. By being nailed to the cross according to the Hebrew alphabet, Jesus added potential forgiveness to those laws against us. He secured himself as the only true consolidated creditor. The periodic table tells us this was in the flesh by carbon. If structured, carbon should be most strong. Carbon makes diamond, which is the 6th jewel in Bible list. Carbon is bonds with itself a lot, not like its antipode. The law of non-contradiction is opposite of it.
And it forms many chains, much more than any element. On our dodecagon, we see 270 degrees, the most uncomfortable position. Horizontal lines tell this was works from a lack of relation to God, and perhaps under the earth. Judas best fits here. Dirt. Deeds of God or man. Leaven. Sin ionizes us. Biological gates and pumps use ions, so God uses enemies to communicate, grow, and shape us. Unlike sin, Jesus was pulled back in, while the harmful nuclear idiots were launched from orbit. Noise was cancelled. The other half of our works was polarized, as in repurposed, not filtered, by 90-degree death given of Jesus. Like baptism, Christ takes sin's place in us. Thus sin is annihilated in that he owns it. The unbeliever's sin continues to intersect God. Parable. Goats versus Messiah.
7. Completion. Rest for God. This is the center also, but lacks a red gluon this time. This means polarity, and is our need for it. Red is the pushing away of sin. Christ's love by his Spirit pulls us to a restful salvation center. It's important to take off the 7th day. Lie or lie. Jesus only lied in the grave this day, and that's all we can do for salvation. Unbelievers are those who don't. Nitrogen is the 7th element in the air, as graft, most abundant, but unused. Although he used his body to launch sin out of orbit, to parallel God as a tangent and never cross him again, he was tied down by the Spirit against the inertia. So, unlike unbelievers, so are we now kept. Even passively, sin can't share the same cross as Jesus. Either he goes, or it. But he can't, and it did. Jesus was no bully when he slew sin. God used his own body to have sin die fair and square. We're used to war being deceit, but that's because we lack omnipotence. At the same time, he wasn't manipulated by it either, as some lawyer might challenge. It is only righteous to God to suffer consequences. And those consequences, the ransom, was as temporary as the sin. The ransom was to what did not charge, but what we left God for. It was only due not only that we should be God's people, but that we should be dead to sin. And as Adam left God, Christ left sin. Jesus brought a rope, we cut ours. Gad was last of Jacob's son, but it was worth it in the end. Next time you're tempted to not take a day off, be like Christ instead. The Hebrew alphabet means that Jesus was cut off from the earth physically, as we should set ourselves apart from it mentally. Cleansed, peace, prudence, mustard seed. Thomas would lay in the grave with Christ, but the resurrection was a surprise for him. The Spirit provided for Jesus as a man. Parable. No high seat, careless uniform. 8. The new week begins the new covenant in Jesus' red blood washing away our sins. We drink his water. That blood dropped down to the ground with our independence from Eden, which was never meant for us. The first day is Resurrection Day, the oxygen of the believer. For we must breathe in Christ to take the carbon with oxide as wind in his wings. For he outlasted sin. Bad is not the physical, but in it. Heaven is very physical. The 8 element is naturally blue oxygen. It eats carbon with unorganized waves of zeal. This is the young man who has overcome the wicked one by faith in Jesus. The Spirit fills the void of our heart. The antipode is about omnipotence. Yet this reflect here as our assent to God's will. He wants our choice. And we may also triangle this to 3, the Son's assent to be sent to earth. Unlike red acid that gives away hydrogen ions, the base pulls them. Thus, we're now on the blue side, without red wrath, completed by Spirit's indwelling. Justice, joy. Parable, rejoice, prodigal son. Hebrew alphabet ends with new covenant. Thaddeus questions answer. Kingdom is within. 9. The Spirit is what separates us from unbelievers. This is the law of excluded middle. The third of the 3 greatest laws of logic, according to Aristotle. I mean, we have synced God to the highest laws of communication that can be communicated for logic is communication or sharing. The Spirit discerns and measures for sake of unity. Fluorine has the greatest charge, and most represents the Spirit. It helps other receive electrons, as a baby gets nourishment from the placenta. In John, his person is more likely to be a father. The 9 fruits of the Spirit are here, and the good ground. This is the wise builder, excited for heaven 11. By faith, we have power to overcome here. Temperance, love, dove on earth, overcome thorns. 10. Counting, flip side of eternity, even if not dying. Neon refuses to bond with earthly elements, which provokes unbelievers. Moses' aspect of jasper this time, instead of John's, shines as ionized. It's like singing without being tense, being above the flesh. Joseph was separated from earthly things, on the mountaintop, the everlasting changeless hills which saints speak of. Overcome rocky ground, patience, fortitude, rainbow by cross. The flesh can't get to the Spirit, and we can't get to absolute zero. Unpardonable sin. Duet. God will reward in flesh. 10 fingers and toes. 11. We enter heaven. Salt. God's children in everlasting habitations. Eternal life. Natri tur, no ocean separation. Sun switches poles every 11 years. Parable. Wise virgins. 12. 10 times greater than previous number or people according to Jacob. Multiplication and strength of head. Maybe horn. Earth has 10 times more magnesium than sodium, I hear. God's better than expected. Sound travels through it, hydrogen the fastest. But magnesium is the opposite. Highest damping capacity as it's the lowest density metal. 7. Right back to the center after 12, before another round in the cycle. Completion, rest with us. The center is balance of all God's attributes. It comes before 1 and after 0, except for the initial Gifts of the three kings could be the main Trinity triangle. Gold says, "Get out of here." Frankincense is a spiritual offering toward God, and myrrh is earthly suffering. Stones 3 and 4 of Revelation are the purple inside of the buffer until sin be purged, and green is the main stretched color across the outside of the sphere. Again, this problem of evil is important to give us, and Jesus, time to die. This temporary world is the electrolyte buffer, like those in your blood or in batteries. Magnetism is the bending spectrum of electricity that God uses through Jesus to rid sin, and produce a sort of 12-color wheel, 2 being red, 6 being yellow, and so forth. I would think of gradual linear shifting in color. Alleles separate and sort independently, and finally dominant traits appear. These 3 DNA laws are like Jesus saving us. DNA in the nucleus is like God's plan. mRNA, God's gospel sent. tRNA, spiritual provision, like its salvation. RNA, spiritual code of us written physically in heaven. GGG is glycine. It has max flexibility. Guanine seems to be a giver. In math it's called distributive, like a radio station. But T-thymine is more like a telephone. It's transitive. G is 11 in binary. Like T, it's one way, thus directive. C and A DNA codes. C code match communication, which is basically independence and exchange, meaning not prices. Code A is association in math, where you combine people in a priority parenthesis, like the spirit in believers. It's 0-1 in binary. This means it can't move itself, but the one after means it is pulled from above. If no change in the next 2 letters, then pure adenine code makes lysine it's essential for connecting, as you may have guessed by now. 0-0, completely passive of responsibility temporarily. Only children of wrath. Cytosine alone makes proline, which has its own backbone. Both the second and third quadrant have single rings in the DNA. But G and A in DNA code have double rings because they're married after salvation and in heaven. G pairs with C and T pairs with A. That means God seeks unbelievers, and believers share God's mission. Final thoughts. You can compare all 4 trinities and all 6 across, and all 3 squares. And more, for example, I can see how the top and bottom work, by looking at the 2 perpendicular. By the way, a dodecagon is in line with the golden ratio, that is, in the Fibonacci sequence it's 5/8. I mean, it's precisely 1.6 ratio for all 24 possible 15-degree angles. 625. Jesus brings to us the understanding of God. That is, Jesus is the unit, and everything else is scale proportional to that. It seems like justice would be both actives, and prudence T, temperance C, and fortitude A. I mean, God's instead of ours this time. Magnetism has always gone down the South Pole, then back up along the Earth's surface. So, I might think the counterclockwise movement of this diagram as a slice of the globe, if it helps anything. Enzymes and hydrocarbon families might be interesting.